Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Hope you had a good Diwali. The whole world celebrated with India. We'll bring you the pictures. Also tracking the news as it develops, especially in Gazan hospitals that have run out of fuel and have stopped taking patients. Israel says it tried to help, but Hamas refused. Hamas says it will not negotiate the release of hostages anymore. The world is still calling for a humanitarian pause. The World Health Organization has called the situation dire. Iran wants Muslim countries to arm Palestinians and stop giving oil to Israel. But Saudi Arabia and others are not on board. Meanwhile, a new report details the amount of planning that went into the Hamas attack on Israel. We'll bring you all of it. Did a Ukrainian soldier blow up the Nord Stream pipelines? We have the findings of a new assessment. Why is Nepal investigating an airport built by China? Why has former Prime Minister David Cameron made a comeback in the UK government as foreign minister? What is the big headline expected from the Xi-Biden meeting this week? And why the Colombian law on junk food can be a game changer? All this and more coming up. The headlines first. In Myanmar, pressure is growing on the junta. A fighter jet crashes near the border with Thailand. Anti-coup forces claim they shot down the plane. But the military blames the crash on a technical issue. The junta is facing its most serious challenge since it seized power in 2021. In India, a huge rescue operation is on in the state of Uttarakhand. 40 workers have been trapped inside a tunnel. On Sunday morning, the under-construction tunnel collapsed. Authorities are supplying food and oxygen to the trapped workers. Jailed Philippine human rights campaigner Leila de Lima gets bail. De Lima has been a fierce critic of former President Rodrigo Duterte. She has spent almost 7 years in jail on drug-related charges. The former senator says the charges were fabricated to silence her. Nepal bans TikTok, saying it disturbs social harmony. In the last 4 years, more than 1,500 cases of cybercrime have been reported on the Chinese video sharing app. Many countries, including India, the US and the UK, have already banned TikTok over security concerns. And the European Union shifts to digital visas for the Schengen area. Applicants will no longer need visa appointments or stickers in their passports. The Schengen area comprises 23 of the 27 EU member countries. The change is expected to come into effect soon. Lots of news to cover tonight, but we'd like to start with some celebration. To look back at the weekend and see how the world celebrated Diwali. It's a truly global festival now. Diwali is also known as the Festival of Lights, although in some parts of India, it makes news for the wrong reasons. If you're in the national capital, you know what I'm talking about. The air in Delhi smells of smoke. Pollution levels are at an all-time high. It rained last week. The air quality improved, but over the weekend, it became worse than before. And that's the thing about Diwali now. It becomes less about the celebration and more about the pollution debate. Should you burst firecrackers? The Supreme Court has banned them. Is there a sustainable way of celebrating Diwali? These are questions that plague us every year. And while this debate is important, it's also important to not miss out on the essence of this festival. It celebrates the triumph of good over evil, of light over darkness. It's about families coming together, creating memories and feasting. And it's not just India that celebrated, the whole world joined in. From US Vice President Kamala Harris to UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Like I said, it's a truly global festival now. Take a look at this.
मेरे लिए जहां मेरी भारतीय सेना है, जहां मेरे देश के सुरक्षा बल के जवान तैनात हैं, वो स्थान किसी भी मंदिर से कम नहीं है। जहां आप हैं, वहीं मेरा त्योहार है।
The triumph of good over evil, although in some cases the lines seem blurred. Like when a hospital becomes a flashpoint in a war. You know innocents are dying. You also know that terrorists are using them as human shields. That's what's happening in Gaza. Two major hospitals have shut down, the Al-Shifa and the Al-Quds, both in Gaza City. The Al-Shifa is Gaza's biggest medical facility, a lifeline for the locals, but a military target for Israel. Israeli forces say Hamas has built tunnels underneath and they want to demolish them. So the IDF has encircled this hospital. Inside, they ran out of fuel. Israel says it offered to help, but Hamas refused. Hamas says Israel is lying. Now, this is a dangerous game of politics and military tactics. And at stake are thousands of lives. Let me show you what's happening at the Al-Shifa hospital. Doctors are operating on patients using smartphone flashlights. Take a look, and I must warn you, some of what you see tonight will be very disturbing. That's the story of many hospitals in Gaza. 20 out of 36 hospitals are shut. Gaza's healthcare system has collapsed. Yesterday, it suffered another major blow. The Al-Shifa hospital declared that it was closed. It stopped taking new patients. The hospital had no electricity, water, or medicines. The shortages began with the war, but for the past month, they managed somehow. They used generators to get electricity, but yesterday, they also ran out of fuel. And there were critical patients inside, many of them on life support. Without electricity, their machines stopped working. Some of them did not make it. At least 32 patients have died due to power cuts. This includes 3 premature babies. And there are others still inside. Local health officials are asking for a safe passage. They want Egypt to rescue the critical patients.
The accumulation of garbage and medical waste inside the corridors of the complex, the lack of water in the departments and bathrooms, and the power outages threatens to kill everyone present, including patients, medical staff, and the displaced, whose number is still estimated at 2,500 displaced inside the corridors of the Shifa medical complex.
Locals blame Israel for targeting a hospital, but Israel has a different story to tell. Prime Minister Netanyahu says they tried to help. Israeli forces offered fuel to the Al-Shifa hospital as much as 300 liters, but Hamas refused to take it.
No, on the contrary, we offered actually last night to give them enough fuel to operate the hospital, operate the incubators and so on, because we have obviously no battle with patients or with civilians at all. And I think every civilian death, every dead baby is a tragedy. But that tragedy should be placed squarely at the responsibility of Hamas.
In their defense, Israel also released a video. They say it shows Israeli forces carrying fuel to the hospital. So Israel says it delivered fuel. It also says Hamas is using this hospital. It's a sanctuary for terrorists. According to Israeli intelligence, Hamas has built a facility below the hospital building. The hospital had a basement. When Hamas took power in 2007, they took control of the basement and they dug further underground. Israel believes this underground facility has multiple meeting areas. It has living spaces and storage facilities. It's a multi-story complex. Plus, it's not the only one. Hamas has other infrastructure nearby, like administrative buildings. Most of this information is source-based, though, and selectively leaked to the Western press. We do not have independent verification. But the U.S. seems to agree with Israel's assessment. The Americans, too, believe that Hamas is using civilian infrastructure.
And there is plenty of open source information, John, to indicate that Hamas uses lots of different civilian institutions, including hospitals, to store weapons for command and control, to house its fighters.
Hamas, of course, was swift to deny all these charges. They also say it's impossible to get fuel supplies due to constant bombardment by Israel. Locals in and around the hospital are simply too afraid to step out. They fear they'll be attacked. So Hamas is shifting the blame back on Israel. And amid this constant back and forth, hundreds of lives hang in the balance. This hospital, Al-Shifa, has 650 patients, many in need of urgent medical attention. It also has 500 healthcare workers and about 2,500 displaced locals who took refuge here. They're all sitting ducks now. The US says it does not want a hospital to become a battleground. The European Union has called for an immediate pause in fighting.
In this 27 statement, we ask for an immediate pause. I'm saying that in plural, not a single one, but several ones, pauses.
Israel will have to negotiate this carefully. Rising civilian casualties will mean higher international pressure. As of now, Israeli forces are at the gates of the Al-Shifa hospital. Hamas has suspended all negotiations on the release of hostages. Down south in Khan Yunis, there are fresh reports of bombing. The IDF says it has carried out 4,300 strikes on the Gaza Strip in the past month. The death toll has crossed 11,000, with more than 4,000 of the dead being children. So while demolishing the Hamas terror infrastructure is important, it is coming at an alarmingly high cost. The loss of innocent lives. Like I said, the lines between good and evil seem more blurred than ever. For our next story, let's go back to where it all began. The morning of October 7th, Hamas attacked Israel. Israel was caught unawares, so was the rest of the world, and with good reason. Because look at the border between Israel and Gaza. Separating Israel and Gaza is a 65-kilometer-long barrier. It cost around $1.1 billion. So how did Hamas breach it? Also, how did Israel not see it coming? We've been discussing this on and off. The whole world has been asking this question. And some reports have come out in the past. They talk about intelligence failure. But now we have a new assessment. This one talks about how Hamas planned the entire attack. It was more than a year in the making. And here's what they did to pull it off. The first step of their plan was deception, planting the seeds of doubt. Hamas knew that Israel would suspect something, so they tried to distract them. How? By telling them what they wanted to hear. Hamas and Israel were adversaries, but in the last year, they appeared to be bridging the divide because Hamas leaders had changed their tune. They told Israel they did not want a war. They gave them secret information about attacks by other groups. In fact, they passed on intelligence about the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They knew Israel wanted this information, so Hamas passed it on to gain trust, and it worked. Israeli leaders believed that Hamas was indeed changing. Of course, there was some rhetoric, with Hamas leaders calling for Israel's annihilation. But it did not bother Israel, because they were getting what they wanted. Tensions along Gaza were at an all-time low. Workers were coming into work. So for them, it was a win-win situation. Because Israel already had a lot on their plate. They'd seen multiple elections, the most far-right government in their history, and of course, the protests over the judicial reform. All of this kept Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu very busy, and he was just happy to have Hamas out of his face. Which brings us to step number 2, planning. Hamas had fooled Israel, but they could not attack without a plan. And that's what they were working on for a year. Needless to say, it was all very hush-hush. Only a handful of people knew, and Hamas planned to keep it that way. Even their top political leaders were clueless. Throughout Gaza, they conducted military exercises, sometimes above the ground, sometimes in their tunnel network. The plan was quite simple: prepare for any eventuality. It was during this training that they picked potential targets, like Israel's population centers and its military bases. To attack them, Hamas needed to know everything about them. So they used technology. Cheap drones were flown into the country. It helped them map the locations. They looked at pictures on the internet, social media posts were analyzed, they even gathered information from day laborers, those who went from Gaza to Israel to work. Now, of course, all this intelligence gathering does not sound very sophisticated, but Hamas did not need that. All they needed was a rough idea of what things were like. Then came step number 3, the actual attack. The plan was shared with only a few people. It's not clear where the weapons came from, but the best guess is from across the border, from Jordan. It's also not clear how many weapons reached them, but it looks like they were already prepared for a long offensive. Which brings us to October 7th. In the early hours of dawn, Hamas fired a barrage of rockets, at least 3,000 of them. It was meant to distract Israel, to catch them off guard. After which, Hamas terrorists breached the border. Drones were used to blind border sensors. Bulldozers were used to breach the wall. They breached the border at 30 different points, 30. And within minutes, they were inside Israel. What followed was a brutal assault. Women and children killed, houses burnt, hundreds held hostage. It was all planned. But even the Hamas did not think it would be so easy. They expected better resistance from Israel. They also expected Israel to hit back hard, which it did. And it's important to underline this here, that Hamas saw it coming. They knew that Israel would retaliate. They knew there would be heavy losses. Yet they carried out this attack. Why did they do it? Because according to Hamas, it was all a sacrifice to kickstart the cause of Palestinian resistance. 1 month later, more than 11,000 civilians have been killed. This includes more than 4,000 children. And it's not hard to believe that Hamas expected this. But the fact that they went on with it tells you how little they cared about the consequences. Hamas knew people would die if they attacked, and yet they did it. Now the people of Gaza are paying the price for it. Meanwhile, an extraordinary meeting took place on Saturday, a joint meeting of the Arab League and the OIC. The OIC is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And this meeting was held in Riyadh. 57 Islamic nations participated. On the agenda was the Israel-Hamas war. The Islamic nations had gathered to find a way forward, a way to help the Palestinians of Gaza. But it's hard to get so many countries to agree on something, especially on a complex issue like the future of Gaza. Iran wanted to arm Palestinians. The rest did not agree. Iran wanted to put an oil embargo on Israel. Others did not agree. So the divisions came to the fore. But on some points, there was consensus. Every Islamic nation demanded an end to hostilities. Every one of them condemned Israel. And every OIC member wants to send aid to Gaza.
The kingdom affirms its categorical rejection of the continuing aggression, occupation and forced displacement of the people of Gaza, and stresses that Israel bears responsibility for the crimes committed against Palestinian people and resources.
Our goal is the delivery of humanitarian aid without pause. What is needed is a permanent ceasefire, not a temporary one.
The first step is a ceasefire and a halt to the killing of civilians in Gaza and ending the indiscriminate attacks on civilians.
Well, that was the easy part. No real scope for different opinions there. Another thing everyone agreed on was how useless the United Nations was. They called on the UN Security Council to put forth a ceasefire resolution. Although this message was really just for one country, and that is the United States of America, because Washington has been rejecting calls for a ceasefire. it has been backing Israel. So the final OIC resolution was a not-so-subtle message to Joe Biden.
United Nations Security Council has clearly shown that it is unable to live up to the expectations of the international community and that reform is absolutely necessary. But I believe that with the collective will of the Arab world and the Muslim world, and as His Excellency the Secretary General pointed out, the number of countries and the size of these countries, we have the weight to be able to push in that direction. And I am sure that we will do all that we can, and that with the instructions that we have received from the leadership of these countries now, that we will be taking a very, very strong message.
The Gulf states are watching Biden's moves, and there will be consequences. That is the message. But what those consequences will be is still up for debate. And that was a major disagreement during Saturday's OIC meeting. There was no real plan on how to proceed. On the one hand, you had Iran. Iran backs Hamas. It considers Israel its mortal enemy. Tehran also has close ties with other groups, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. It trains and arms all these groups. So obviously, Iran's suggestion was the most confrontational.
Cutting any sort of political or economic relations with the Zionist regime by the Islamic countries. In this regard, trade boycott against the Zionist regime, especially in the energy field, should be prioritized.
Raisi wants Muslim nations to cut ties with Israel to stop selling oil to Israel. And this has been done before. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Arab nations led by the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia stopped oil shipments to Israel's allies. This caused the world's first oil shock. The price of oil rose by 300% over the next year. So an oil embargo is a potent weapon that the Islamic nations possess. But Saudi Arabia does not want to use it. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman does not want to go down that road. Reports say countries that have normalized ties with Israel, like Bahrain and the UAE, are not keen on severing them. They don't want to cut ties. Plus, most Islamic nations do not want to arm groups like Hamas. So most of Raisi's suggestions were shot down. In the end, the OIC nations could only agree on a ceasefire and relief for the Palestinians, not anything punitive. Although that does not take away from the show of solidarity, Raisi became the first Iranian president in 11 years to visit Saudi Arabia. It was a milestone, also a message. Whatever internal divisions in the greater Islamic world, the Israel-Hamas war is bridging those divides. If there isn't some respite for the people of Gaza, it could lead to a rift between the Islamic nations and the West. Now let's look at the world's other major war, the war in Ukraine. That war too has seen its share of crimes. Among the biggest ones was this, an attack on the Nord Stream gas pipelines. This happened last September, and it crippled Europe's energy supplies. You see, the Nord Stream pipelines connect Russia to Germany. They run beneath the Baltic Sea. Before the war, they were crucial to Europe's energy security. But last September, there were underwater explosions. They took out 3 of the 4 pipes and cut off Europe from cheap Russian gas. Both NATO and Russia called it an act of sabotage. No group claimed responsibility for the attack. All sides pointed fingers at each other. And now a new theory, a new report has come out. It blames a Ukrainian soldier for the explosions, a colonel who has worked with Ukraine's special forces. His name is Roman Chervinsky. Our next report has the details.
On September 26, 2022, at about 2 a.m., off the coast of Denmark's Bornholm Island, an explosion changed the face of the war in Ukraine. That explosion was followed by another about 17 hours later. The result was that Europe suddenly had nothing to lose. The undersea explosions ruptured the Nord Stream pipelines that were used to transport natural gas from Russia to Europe. On September 26th, the same natural gas began leaking, rising through the sea and escaping into the atmosphere. Who was behind this act of sabotage? A new investigation has put this name forward. Roman Chervinsky. On Saturday, media reports pointed the finger at this man, a former Ukrainian intelligence officer and a critic of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Chervinsky is currently in pre-trial detention over a different case. He faces 12 years in prison for allegedly overstepping his authority. And now, the Nord Stream blasts are also being blamed on this agent. His supporters say he's being set up, that someone high up wants him out of the way. The new Nord Stream blast accusation would definitely put a target on Chervinsky's back, because a lot was tied to the pipelines. You see, the Nord Stream was an economic link connecting Western Russia to Germany. Russia made money selling natural gas to Europe, and Europe had a steady supply of a cheap fossil fuel. Both parties benefited, but these Nord Stream pipelines also created a dependency. Europe was beholden to Russia for cheap energy, and Russia had been tweaking the gas output since its war in Ukraine began. This had the potential to affect European sentiment, perhaps lower public support for Ukraine. After all, no one cares about a neighbor when they're freezing in winter. But suddenly, this problem vanished, or should we say, blew up. Which begs the question, who was behind the attack? Who had the most to gain? When the attack took place, everyone picked sides. The West blamed Russia, saying Moscow wanted to cripple Europe. But if Moscow was using the Nord Stream as leverage, why would it destroy the pipeline? Russia blamed the West, specifically the US. It said the US wanted to end Europe's dependency on Russian gas. So, Washington blew up Moscow's leverage. This may sound more logical, but there was no real proof. There still isn't. But now, with Chervinsky, we have a new suspect. The media reports cite unnamed sources, both in Europe and Ukraine. The sources describe Chervinsky as the attack's coordinator. He handled logistics for the sabotage crew, getting them a boat and deep-sea diving equipment. The crew then allegedly sailed into the Baltic and planted explosives on the pipelines. And the reports say Chervinsky did not act alone. Someone else planned the attack. He apparently got his orders from senior officers under General Valery Zaluzny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. So does this mean Ukraine conducted the attack? Well, there's still no conclusive proof. And another detail complicates things further. Reports say Ukraine's president was kept out of the loop, that he was unaware of the plan. That means if Ukraine did conduct it, the Nord Stream attack was a rogue operation. So the plot thickens. Russia has called it alarming that Zelensky was unaware of the plan. It wants more names of those involved. But what action will Moscow take on Chervinsky and his crew and on the higher-ups? We'll have to wait and see.
This week, the world will witness a meeting between rivals, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. The Chinese president is traveling to San Francisco. He'll sit down with the US president on Wednesday. Needless to say, the world will be watching this and looking forward to the outcomes. But do not expect any dramatic announcements. Yes, the two leaders will get a chance to talk, and yes, that is significant, but any major policy changes are unlikely. Biden has been pursuing Xi Jinping for months now. He wanted this meeting, mainly to restore military-to-military ties. This is one of the main priorities for the United States, re-establishing the lines of communication between American and Chinese generals. You see, China had suspended the military dialogue last year. It was in retaliation to Nancy Pelosi's Taiwan visit. She was the US House Speaker then, Nancy Pelosi. She visited Taiwan despite China's protests. And she was the highest-ranking American official to visit the island in decades. So China was provoked, and it responded in kind. It snapped military exchanges with the US. It also launched rocket attacks towards Taiwan. And since then, friction between Washington and Beijing has only grown. So has the threat of a bigger conflict. On Wednesday, Team Biden will try to reverse this course.
The president said he's looking forward to meeting with President Xi. It's going to be in San Francisco. It's going to be a constructive meeting. The president's looking forward to it.
Reports say there is a deal in the works. It's about the use of artificial intelligence in defense. The US and China could ban it. They could ban the use of AI in defense. This ban will be aimed at autonomous weapons like drones. It will also cover nuclear warheads. Now, this would be a very significant move, not to mention a positive one, because the world is wary of AI weapons. So if America and China take the lead and agree to ban them, others are likely to follow suit. But what about the other contentious issues, like the many military flashpoints between America and China? Will they discuss the PLA's activities around Taiwan or the South China Sea? What about the Chinese spy balloons, the ones that America shot down at the beginning of this year? Will any of these subjects come up too? At the moment, it looks unlikely. The US and China have a long list of disagreements, like the Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas war, the dispute over Taiwan, the PLA's activities in the South China Sea, and their provocations near the Philippines. On all these issues, the US and China remain at odds. According to one report, and I'm quoting here, there has been no meeting of the minds. In fact, China has another problem with the US. It doesn't want Washington to use the word competition. They should not say competition when they talk about China. But the US uses this term frequently, including their president, Joe Biden. They keep saying the US and China are in a quote-unquote strategic competition. Beijing doesn't see it that way, though.
China is not afraid of competition, but we oppose defining the China-US relationship in terms of competition. When it comes to concerns, the United States should earnestly respect China's reasonable concerns and legitimate development rights, rather than only emphasizing its own concerns while harming China's interests.
Stop harming our interests. That's the message from China ahead of the Xi-Biden meeting. Biden says the US must manage its differences with China. But is Beijing willing to play ball? Will Xi Jinping cooperate with Joe Biden? Will they be able to find common ground? Wednesday's meeting will test Biden's resolve. Meanwhile, in Nepal, China is under investigation. Kathmandu has put a Chinese project under the microscope. This is about the Pokhara airport. Pokhara is Nepal's second biggest city. In January this year, it got a new international airport. It was built by China. It turned out to be a debt trap. Now, this is not a new story. It's a classic case of China's predatory lending. China makes big promises. Massive and unsustainable projects are commissioned. In the end, the host country is left with a giant debt burden. Now, most nations just accept Beijing's terms. Some even make compromises with their sovereignty and submit to Beijing's bullying. But Nepal has decided to take a stand. Their anti-corruption agency is investigating this project. And Kathmandu has good reasons to order this investigation. This project has many loopholes. The first one is its practicality, its viability. Did Nepal even need an airport like this? The answer is no. This is an international airport, but Pokhara does not get many international passengers. The airport opened earlier this year. It took 6 months for one international flight to land. In fact, let me give you the specifics. The airport opened on the 1st of January 2023. The first international flight landed on 21st June this year, a full 6 months after opening. And it happened to be a Chinese flight. A Sichuan Airlines aircraft brought some athletes. They were visiting for a quote-unquote goodwill boat tour. So traffic is clearly a problem if you have one flight in 6 months. And this has been a jinxed project from the word go. It was first conceived way back in 1975, but stalled for many reasons, like public opposition, dodgy contracts, and in the final stages, the Wuhan virus pandemic. So it took almost 50 years for the airport to see the light of day. And when it did, China was quick to take credit for it. When the airport opened, China declared it, and I'm quoting again, that it was a flagship project of the China-Nepal Belt and Road Cooperation. But remember, the project was commissioned and pitched some 50 years back. The BRI did not even exist then. Yet China is calling it a success of the BRI, and that statement has not aged well, because for Nepal, it's more reliability than a success now. Like with most BRI projects, the airport was built with Chinese loans to the tune of $216 million. And these loans came from the Import-Export Bank of China. And what were the interest payments like? $3.2 million annually. So Kathmandu has to pay Beijing $216 million as the principal amount and $3.2 million every year as interest. And that's not all. Nepal also has to bear the operational cost of this project. We don't have a figure for that, but running an airport is not cheap. Running an international airport is not cheap, certainly. And here is what Nepal has been left with: a dead piece of infrastructure, a large loan, and a loss-making airport. So they've ordered an investigation. Investigators recently visited Pokhara. They spent a few days at the airport, assessed its construction quality. And going by some claims, the building quality was compromised. The project's infrastructure was quote-unquote not sound. There were at least 20 complaints about the construction quality. Do you know who the contractor was? A Chinese company, China CAMC Engineering. This is part of Sinomac. It's a state-owned Chinese conglomerate. It builds tools for construction. And what does China have to say in its defense? Well, Beijing has defended the project. It says China CAMC implemented strict quality standards. And Nepal will take some time to come out with a full report. But once it does, once it's ready, Kathmandu should make this report public, expose China and its predatory infrastructure projects.
Israel is a terrorist state. Occupation is a crime. Occupation is a crime. Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
Now let's turn our attention to the UK, where the Conservative Party merry-go-round has claimed another victim. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is safe, but his Home Secretary Suella Braverman got the boot. Her exit, though, was a foregone conclusion. Last week, she'd angered a lot of people. Prime Minister Sunak, fellow Tories, supporters of the police, and basically anyone with a hint of decency. Braverman made a charge against the London Metropolitan Police. She said they had a pro-Palestinian bias, that they were going soft on pro-Palestinian demonstrators. They were preparing to take out a protest march on Saturday. You just saw what it looked like. The UK has seen a lot of those recently. The marches have largely been peaceful, but that did not matter to Braverman. She wanted this one to be banned. The London police said there was no reason to ban it. And Prime Minister Rishi Sunak accepted that. He said he respects the right to peaceful protest. And that should have been that. But Braverman was not ready to back down. She put out an article in the media where she took a dig at the London police. She called the pro-Palestine demonstrators, and I'm quoting, hate marchers, Islamists and mobs. It undermined Prime Minister Sunak's message from earlier that day, and he decided to sack Braverman. Now came the tricky part. Who could replace her as Home Secretary? And it had to be someone acceptable to Braverman's supporters and those who applauded her anti-migration rhetoric. So Rishi Sunak shuffled his ministers around. James Cleverly was the Foreign Minister of the UK. Sunak made him the new Home Secretary. And Cleverly made it a point to adopt Braverman's catchphrase after he took office.
Well, it's been a huge privilege to serve as Foreign Secretary, and in that time I worked very closely with my colleagues in the Home Office, cracking down on illegal migration, reducing the number of small boat arrivals, and now as the Home Secretary I'm absolutely committed to stopping the boats as we promised.
All that boat talk is deliberate. It was something that gave joy to Suella Braverman supporters, so Rishi Sunak wants it to continue.
I have had a very good conversation with the Prime Minister, who's made it very clear that he wants us to deliver on our promises, to stop the boats, to protect the British people, make sure everybody feels secure in their lives. Thank you very much.
So Cleverly is now the Home Secretary, and Braverman got the sack. As I said, her sacking was no surprise, but then something unpredictable happened. This big shock involved another face, a familiar one at 10 Downing Street. Former Prime Minister David Cameron. Rishi Sunak summoned David Cameron to his office today, and the former Prime Minister left the building as the UK's new Foreign Secretary or the Foreign Minister. That's right, David Cameron has returned to the centre of power after a 7-year break. He was the Prime Minister of the UK between 2010 and 2016. He is the one who brought about, opposed and resigned because of Brexit. Cameron was a Prime Minister from a different era, a so-called centrist who led the Tories to power in 2010. He championed fiscal prudence, gay marriage and trade with China, among other things. So clearly a mixed outlook. But this won him re-election in 2015. His centrist policies helped him appeal to voters across a broad spectrum, and Rishi Sunak could do with some of that appeal right now. The UK general election will be held by January 2025 at the latest. So Prime Minister Sunak has a little over a year to go as PM. And he is very far behind in opinion polls. He is trailing by double digits according to most. The UK Conservative Party has been drawing flack for months with their inability to fix the economy and bundles of lettuce outlasting prime ministers. The Tories are predicted to lose badly in the upcoming elections. So Sunak has brought back a man who helped them win in the past. And Cameron has accepted the role, despite mentioning disagreements with quote-unquote some individual decisions made by Rishi Sunak. But after that, David Cameron called Sunak a strong and capable Prime Minister. He said he wanted to help Sunak form a strong team ahead of the next election. So will he succeed? Will this Cameron gambit work for Sunak and the Tories? We'll be following the developments closely. Now let's talk about something that's seldom discussed: organ donation. In India, one person is added to the organ donation wait list every 10 minutes. One person every 10 minutes. It tells you how grave the situation is. Turns out it also has a gender problem. And this is according to the latest data that has come out. 4 out of 5 organ donors in India are women. What about those who receive organs? 4 out of 5 recipients in India are men. In other words, 80% of the donors are women, but 80% of the recipients are men. So why are these numbers so skewed? Our next report tells you.
Last December, Indian politician Lalu Prasad Yadav underwent a kidney transplant. Sounds like a normal procedure, a simple transplant surgery, but it made headlines everywhere. Why? Because the donor was his daughter, Rohini Acharya. It was shown as a story of sacrifice, a daughter doing what she could to save her father. The optics were great, but data suggests this is the reality of India's organ donation. It's all about sacrifice, and usually it's about sacrifice by women. A recent study analyzed organ donations from 1995 to 2021. 36,640 transplantations were carried out in India. 29,000 of them were for men. Only 6,945 were for women. If you put those numbers into perspective, basically, men were 80% of the total recipients for organ donations. But when it comes to donations, it's a completely opposite scenario. Women make up for 80% of the organ donors. And who are these women? They are usually wives or mothers. When their son or husband needs an organ, they are the first to volunteer, which makes them living organ donors. You see, organ donation is easier between family members. This means they are genetically easier. This lessens the risks of rejections. But what explains this disparity? Well, the answer is socio-economic pressure. In our society, men are seen as breadwinners. Women, on the other hand, are seen as caregivers. More often than not, they feel pressurized to donate their organs. On the other hand, men think twice in a situation like this. They hesitate to go into surgery, which means most men donors in India are cadaver donors. That means they donate their organs only when they're dead. These are stories that make for great headlines. A mother giving a kidney to her son, a wife giving her liver to her husband. They are shown as the messiah of sacrifice. and it's society that is to blame for this. Organ donation shouldn't happen under any sort of pressure. It should be a choice that one should take freely. That said, the whole picture isn't too great also. India's organ donation rate is quite bleak. It stands at 0.52 per million people. Every 10 minutes, one person is added to the wait list. In 2022, over 2 lakh patients needed a kidney transplant. Guess how many got it? It was only 7,500 people. That's just 3.4%. So you get the gist. The numbers are bad, which is why more people need to step up, not just women. But more people should be open to donating organs. It's an act that saves lives.
And finally, if you're having a meal while watching the show, we hope it's a healthy one. If you've overindulged during the Diwali festivities, it's time for some much-needed detox. So ditch the junk and put down that burger. Now, most of us know that junk food takes a toll on our health. But if you happen to be in Colombia, it will cost you more than that, quite literally. The South American nation has passed a new law. And what does it do? It taxes ultra-processed food and sugary drinks, aka junk food. It taxes junk food. Now, this is a landmark move. It makes Colombia the first country in the world to tax junk food. It's the first law of its kind anywhere. Health experts have lauded this decision. Campaigners hope that this sets an example for other countries to follow. But the road to incentivizing healthy living has not been easy. The law came into effect this month after years of campaigning. So what exactly does it propose? You'll have to pay more for ultra-processed food. Now, this is usually ready-to-eat food. You see, processing changes a food from its natural state. Processed foods are essentially made by adding salt, oil, or sugar. Ultra-processed foods also have a high quantity of saturated fat, a high content of saturated fat. Think cold cuts, chocolates, potato chips. You get the idea, the good stuff. That's really bad for your heart and health. And since self-restraint has failed in the face, or shall we say mouth of temptation, Colombia is making things official. They've imposed a sort of health tax, similar to the ones that countries have on tobacco and sugary drinks. So starting immediately, there will be an additional tax of 10% on ultra-processed food. And that's just the beginning. By next year, it will be increased to 15%. By 2025, it will be further hiked to 20%. So while your belly fat increases, your wallet will certainly feel lighter. And why has Colombia taken this, what some would call, drastic step? The government says it's not to make money, but rather to tackle lifestyle problems arising out of a poor diet. In 2021, more than 55% of Colombians were found to be overweight. 1 in every 3 adults in the country has high blood pressure. The Colombian diet is also high in sodium. In fact, it has the highest rate in Latin America and among the highest in the world. And here's why that's problematic. Higher salt intake has been linked to stroke and heart failure. In Colombia, it results in almost 25% of deaths annually. You know which country has the highest salt consumption? China. Now, that's one race Beijing wouldn't mind losing, at least we hope so. Hungary comes second. Where's India on the global list? Near the middle of the pack. While salt may be the villain, you and I cannot really escape blame here. We all know that junk food is bad for us. But you know just how bad? Here's what a study in 2019 found. And listen to this carefully. A poor diet kills more people worldwide than tobacco. Apart from cardiovascular diseases and obesity, a diet high on processed food also leads to digestive problems, type 2 diabetes, depression, and even cancer. So the next time you bite into that burger or seek comfort in that bag of chips or the tub of ice cream, do remember, while it might thrill your taste buds, it's likely to increase your chances of stroke as well. So what's the solution? Do you have to ditch fast food entirely? Well, that would be ideal, but life rarely is. So the answer lies in moderation. Experts say limit junk food to once a week, like a cheat day. And the rest of the time, stick to the greens, to beat the blues and be in the pink of health. The color analogy might be bad, but the advice is good. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Italy, the Wanderlust bug seems to have bit a circus lion as it embarked on a night tour of a city near Rome. It was later caught after a 7-hour hunt. In Iceland, residents brace for a volcanic eruption as 900 earthquakes hit the southern part of the island on Monday. And a fuming Novak Djokovic snapped 2 rackets during his match in Italy. Finally, we are taking you back in history. On this day in 1970, Hafiz al-Assad seized power in Syria in a bloodless military coup. He replaced his political mentor as Syria's leader. His son Bashar al-Assad is the current president of Syria. We leave you on that note. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Quanto cavolo! Non ce l'abbiamo davanti casa.
Nóvember, þetta er Austurvegurinn. Grindavík. Talsveit.